Start now. So welcome, Sean.
Hi.
Hi. So today, what is it, December 1st? December 2nd, 2021. We are happy to welcome Sean Rhodes to the 4D Design Department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. And just briefly, Sean leads the multidisciplinary teams at Frog Design, which is a firm that has had a lot of Cranbrook alums go through it and be part of its culture, which is also an exciting connection with you, in addition to the fact that you are a Cranbrook alum from the 2D design program. And I also share alumna status from Frog, which is fun. And your focus has been, according to your bio, on retail, media, financial service verticals. You partner with firms to leverage digital product, service, brand, experience design for business environments. And you've over 18 years of experience and helped bring new products to market, execute strategies, and reboot brands for clients, which include, I'm sure this is just a small sample, American Express, Bloomberg, BNY Mellon, CA, Chrysler, Comcast, Estée Lauder, GE, Goldman Sachs, IMAX, Logitech, McKinsey, Microsoft, and Qualcomm, and there are many more. So we had a bunch of conversations, which was also just really great for me to connect the 4D design program with you and your work and the work at Frog. And we had talked about data and the philosophies around data and the esoteric nature of data, which of course is very core to what happens at 4D. So with that, I am going to yield the floor to you, Sean, and thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Carla. And just such a pleasure to be able to see everybody and have the opportunity to come back to Cranbrook, even though it's virtual. It feels fantastic. And I was just also reflecting on my time at Cranbrook and what was going on from a technology perspective. I was there from 2004 to 2006, and I think we were just starting to have people texting each other. It wasn't really something that was super big at the time. Facebook didn't really exist in any big way. I think MySpace was out there a little bit. Friendster, was kind of ebbing and flowing. And, we were very isolated on campus. Like I always said, and I'm sure it's like this still, very monastic being at Cranbrook. You kind of go off into the woods for a couple of years and you're very isolated and you're having your existential crises and figuring things out and moving things forward. But I think what's a little bit different maybe for you folks that's kind of interesting is like, I know all of you. Like I see you all on Instagram all the time. Through 4D. I follow some of you, so I see, some of your work and your antics. And, I think it's just kind of this amazing, I don't know if Carla, if you feel the same way, about, pre-social media and like heavy duty internet to like what's happening now. It's just kind of a different thing. And I think there are some opportunities and challenges that definitely come with that. But, as I was thinking about kind of what I wanted to put together and share and talk with you folks about, I think there's a lot of those themes that are tied up in there around how, what's happening in technology today opens up some new opportunities for creative people, for designers. And I wanted to just share a little bit of like my history, my past, my practice, a little bit at Cranbrook. I went dredging through some of my old work and down memory lane a little bit into sort of like the work I do now and like where, a couple of ideas of where that's what I was hoping to share and to talk about. Please stop me at any time, challenge me, questions. There might be stuff in here that you know more about than I do, I think, or have a cool different perspective. So I'm hoping to learn as much as I can hopefully share today. So I don't know, with that, I will start sharing. I loved Cranbrook. I had absolutely the best time there. And, like I was saying, so nice to be able to kind of come back. A little bit about me, as Carla was saying, I work at Frog, which is a pretty amazing place. I'll share a little bit about Frog and my time there. We're really kind of vertical agnostic. So I work in a lot of different spaces, but have found like myself in media and financial services, mobility, retail, and then kind of like this sort of new dimension of like future of work. I think organizations are changing, the way people are working are changing, in particular accelerated over the last couple of years, which is super interesting. So we'll talk about some of that stuff. I also teach at NYU at Tandon, which is the engineering school. I teach a design strategy course. We'll talk about that a little bit. And also I'm not a 2016 alum. I'm a 2006 alum. Geez, that's kind of crazy. So yeah, a little bit of what I want to talk about is about me, what I teach, about Frog, a couple of paths. And I think this is stuff I talk about with clients and sort of like in the industry a lot, but I was thinking about it in the context of maybe, what might be some of the opportunities for folks like you coming out of Cranbrook later, and then just like Q&A at the end. So let me just jump in. Start out with, I think some of the things that were inspiring to me, kind of growing up, the things that made me. I was a big fan of Richard Scarry. I don't know if anybody else, read those books. And there were all these books about like stuff that was happening in the world, cars, trucks, cities. And I think I was just really interested in like how things worked. I love the illustrations, of course, they were really cool, but I really got excited about understanding the underpinnings, the underworkings of things, even, as a young kid. And that sort of evolved into stuff like David Macaulay, The Way Things Work. He had all these books on how mechanical things worked, or how civilizations, how the pyramids were built, things like that. He was also a teacher at RISD, which kind of got me excited about that. So I went to RISD, studied illustration. And then I ended up leaving RISD and going to work in New York, at the beginning of the commercial internet, which kind of took me off on a very different direction than I was thinking. Most of my friends and peers became like directors at Pixar. And, I started to get involved with technology and software. Kind of like fast forward into my 20s, and I started to like get really attracted to books like this, Guns, Germs, and Steel. I don't know if folks, are familiar with Jared Diamond. He's a really interesting sort of scientist, and he wrote this books and the thing I sort of found compelling about it was it kind of had some explanations for why different civilizations developed the way that they did, and how that sort of through the thread of time unveiled like what the present looked like. And I thought that was really interesting. And I was reading some of this stuff right before I came to Cranbrook. And I think I came to Cranbrook with sort of this notion that I was interested in exploring what some of those deeper hidden sort of underlying structure of the world was, and exploring that through design in a way that could help me to understand and be sort of more of a change agent. Like, I think that was like where my mindset was kind of coming into Cranbrook. And I was sort of hopeful that through the studio practice, through the dialogue, I would be able to sort of tap into that in unique ways. So my first year I came in, and again I was in the 2D department. I started to make like all of these like really weird, and at the time or now I would just like consider like bad posters and things, trying to explore some of these concepts, and typography, wood sculptures. And I really struggled my first term. I struggled, and I was just trying to like crack this nut and trying to figure out what was interesting and cool. And again, back to this idea of I was trying to uncover something big and then be able to like reflect that through design in a way that would be meaningful and like sort of change oriented. And I don't think I was alone. I think in our critiques, a lot of folks were sort of sharing this sentiment. It was also at the time of like the first Gulf War was starting. We had just come out of like the internet bubble. It was sort of exploding. And I think a lot of us in the class were sort of looking for our design to do something more. And then I think this was sort of a common refrain is, it would be better to start a soup kitchen than design a poster that's talking about ending, hunger, something like that. So, I think shifting gears into my second year with all of these like amazing people, like I had an absolutely incredible, sets of groups of people. Josh Walton, who I'm pretty sure, I know Carla, you're buddies with Josh, was the year ahead of me. Keitra Dixon was in my class. Cleon Peterson was in my class. Kelly Miller. There were just like all these like really, really incredible. Everyone was incredible, but in particular, there were some real standout Cranebrookers at the time. And I think as we kind of went forward into that second year, I think I started to like let go a little bit of what some of my like very sort of big ambitions were for the design work, and sort of got into a much more meditative state around doing more formal oriented things. I started to create all these like photographic mandalas and all of this sort of stuff that I think was much more meditative. And I think I found that non-cerebral aspect of the work was like sort of very freeing. And it wasn't necessarily what I thought I was going to do, but it was where the process took me. And that was happening on one side. On the other side, I was sort of thinking about back to like what makes the world work the way that it does. And I started to do a lot of research into things like global, monetary funds, how basically monetary policy in the 20th century shaped, sort of the world that we live in, but really kind of into the structural stuff. I don't think the two things ever really met. But it was interesting for me to be able to, and I think this is sort of the beauty of Cranbrook, you just kind of go where the work leads you. And I think as I sort of let go of what I thought was cool or what I thought was important and followed that path, I was much happier. I mean, one of my, I was basically much happier, and I think the work was more interesting. I was also spending a lot of time in lounge, which was really fun, trying to throw interesting parties. I had a bunch of people that I played records with, which was a real blast. I don't know. I felt like that was a really good creative outlet for me. I think got engaged with the community a lot more, got a lot more social. These were all of some of the flyers that we put together, and we were just having a lot of fun. This is some more of the work from year two, more of the mandala work with photography, also doing a lot of video and costume building. Built this like interesting costume of tweed of boom boxes, and shot a lot of videos. I don't know, I just started to have a lot more fun with what I was doing. And, I think one of my mentors just said, like, you got to start paying attention to what you pay attention to. And I think that really, fed me well. I think also maybe just transitioning into like, there was some stuff that happened in the middle, but transitioning into, going to Frog. I came to Frog, I was really excited about joining this organization. I'll talk a little bit more about the organization, but it was a place where I think a lot of sort of legendary industrial design, product design had taken place in the 70s and 80s. And the time that I was joining, the internet was starting to get bigger, social was starting to get bigger. I started right after the first iPhone came out, like a week or two after that. So like something big was obviously starting to happen, which was cool. And, I got to jump in on these projects that were different than things that I had worked on before. And I'd worked in software, I'd worked in architecture and urban planning before. So like, big, interesting, meaty problems, but Frog, I think, tackled them or afforded the opportunities to explore them in a very different way. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the stuff I've worked on in the, across my time at Frog. This one was really like a watershed kind of moment for me. A company called TouchTunes, and if you go out to bars, you've probably seen these out there. They're a digital jukebox that lives in a bar. They've got a mobile app. We worked on this refresh or this rebuild of the product. When we started working with them, their product looked like Windows 95 in like a horrible PC shell from the 90s. And we redesigned the entire product, the interface. And, it was a dream project, especially for a music head. We got to go to bars, we got to hang out, with bartenders and people playing music in bars, talk about music a lot, talk about, what it meant to them, how it fit into their lives, all of like kind of the traditional ethnographic research stuff that goes into it. And, I had a lot of experience with that at that point, a lot of experience with product design, more in particular for web. This was, I think, one of my first sort of embedded UI projects and convergent projects where it was converged with industrial design. But I had my head wrapped around it. The thing I didn't have my head wrapped around at this point, and why this I think was so important, is when we rolled out this product and we put it into bars. We took the old ones out of the bars, we put the new ones into bars, and they started to do about 50% more business. And this like light bulb went off in my head, and I was like, wow, business is an interesting tool to combine with design and strategy. And if I can be as knowledgeable about business as I can about design and technology, that could be really powerful. And we'd done things that were kind of intuitive and not really understanding or thinking about the business implications. Like one of them was, we included essentially like a shopping cart on the jukebox. So a traditional jukebox, you put in a quarter and then you select your song and you play. It's just sort of the sequence of events. What we did is we sort of reversed that, where we enabled people to create a shopping cart of all of their songs, put them in there, and then pay. So I think that was part of the reason why people started to spend more money on it. And I think they actually liked it better. We also oriented the screen to be horizontal as opposed to vertical, which most sort of digital signage is vertical. And part of the reason why we did that was because picking songs, as we found, was like a social activity. So you didn't have one person up there, you had a bunch of people surrounding this, and it became more of this sort of nucleus that generated more activity and essentially more fun. So that was a real interesting watershed moment for me. I think this was early in my time at Frog in the first couple years. I've been with Frog for 13 years. I started in 2008. So it's been a really wonderful and intense run. Part of the reason why I stayed is like every year I was like, oh, this is a career defining project. Oh, this is a career defining project. And they have just like kind of kept coming and coming and really interesting stuff. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the future, more closer to the future. In the last couple of years, I led teams that helped the new HBO Max, the streaming platform, launch. So, obviously the 800-pound gorilla is Netflix, and they make great content. They've got a great product. HBO is an incredible organization, and sort of the mandate that we came in with was like, how do we start to create a product experience and product strategy that is as differentiated as HBO's content? And we're just going to make the assumption that HBO is going to continue to make great content. That's not what we're doing. We're thinking about everything in the product experience. And I think also this idea of how can we help the HBO win, and this could be subscribers or for people to spend time on it, with product differentiation. So what I mean by that is, if we just copied everything that Netflix had in their product, it wouldn't be any different. We'd just be competing on, they've got House of Cards or Squid Games, and we've got Game of Thrones. They'd only be competing on the content. We're thinking about how do we open up new dimensions of competition. And I think one of the things that we landed on through the product strategy was how they could start to leverage influencers. So these are actors, directors, people that are affiliated with all the content they're putting together, and start to leverage social in a different way through the platform that enables them to compete. So on top of a lot of other things. So that was a really interesting project to work on. We helped them all the way through launch. The product strategy that we laid out is being implemented over the years. But I think media is a space that I've sort of spent a lot of time in. I think one of the ideas that sort of came up through this work that I'll sort of touch on later is this idea that that we're all sort of like living in this attention economy. The thing that most businesses are trying to do is, basically spend a lot of time with us, and those that are successful in doing that will basically, be successful, sort of overall in selling things. And it's a real mindset shift. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I think some of the implications for, potentially where some opportunities for you folks later on. Also, like kind of similarly, work with FanDuel on some projects recently. Spent a lot of time with their chief product officer trying to figure out, they have all these like different gaming verticals, so horse racing, sports betting, fantasy sports, how essentially they can sort of bring all of those together. Another sort of like sports related one, I don't know if there are any football fans out there, but we worked with the XFL, which was starting a new, rebooting a football league to compete with the NFL. And they came to us and said, if we were going to start a competitor to the NFL that was going to be a digital first league and a fan first league, what would that look like? So we helped them to create that strategy and build, the first sets of applications and things to do that. They were doing okay, and then COVID came and shut them down, and they were bought by one of my favorite celebrities, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and a bunch of partners of his. So we'll see what happens to XFL. Another one, we're relatively recently, again, I do a lot of work in financial services, is working for JP Morgan. And this one was really interesting. Onyx is their blockchain unit. And what they're trying to do with blockchain, JP Morgan is kind of like the bank to banks, to other banks and other big corporations. So when banks need to pay one another, or when Google needs to pay Microsoft or things like that, JP Morgan is basically the pathways that goes through. And the way that they're thinking about blockchain is not really in a decentralized way. They're obviously, have a vested interest in things being more centralized, but as blockchain is a way to like pull friction out of the process. So like an example is like, when you buy a car and you take out a loan, there's like a tremendous amount of paperwork through the whole process. You need to like you need to go to the dealer, you need to get a loan, you need to have a lien on the car, then you need to register the car, you need to get insurance, you need to do like kind of all of this running around for all of this sort of paperwork around the transaction. Whereas like, I think in a future where, the car and the transaction are all on the blockchain, you basically just go and buy the car and everything is sort of plugged in and taking care of itself. And I think those are the types of things that JP Morgan is looking for blockchain to be able to solve, not just for consumers, but like for businesses all over. And what we were able to do is to work with them to sort of catalyze their vision, how they're going to market. And I think more interestingly was kind of how they might be engaging sort of the technology constituents in ways to start adopting their technology and leveraging that. So, similar, I think there's this interesting thing happening. There's an interesting transition, right, where technology used to always be sold in an organization from a top-down perspective. It was a big purchase. Now, anybody can go fire up an S3 instance. They can get started, using Twilio to start sending messaging around. It's all very self-service and readily adoptable. Stripe is the same thing. If you want a payments platform, then you can start just easily leveraging that and integrating these bits of software together. I think that's a very different mindset for JP Morgan. So trying to help them to understand how to activate those communities to start to leverage the technology, to start to, kind of make some of these new solutions move forward was really interesting and fascinating. The last one I'm going to share with you, and these are all like things I was kind of more directly involved with, was some recent work for Freddie Mac. And Freddie Mac is, basically they enable Americans to like buy houses. They basically, this is a little bit boring, but they basically, when someone buys a home, and a bank issues them a mortgage, that bank then turns around and sells that mortgage to Freddie Mac, and therefore gets more liquidity back so that they can issue another mortgage. Freddie Mac is kind of like a pseudo-governmental agency. They set the standards for these mortgages, and they'll basically buy any mortgage that meets those standards. And then they package those mortgages together and then sell them to a bond market. So they kind of play this like very integral role in, how Americans, buy homes and get mortgages. They basically came to us and they said, there's this really serious problem. It's a Black American home ownership gap. Essentially, housing discrimination was made illegal in 1968, and at that point there was a 30-point gap between Black and white home ownership, and that gap has just kind of grown today. It's not any different from when it was illegal, when it was legal, to now when it's legal. So we really need to do something about that. So this was, I think, a sort of fundamentally different design challenge, where it's really the roots of this are in systemic racism. So hey, there's limited utility in approaching this with a like sort of human-centered design approach, which is pretty typical for us. We really needed to understand and map the overarching system, and then understand where the leverage points are in that system so that we could change them. And what we're seeing here is sets of we did do a lot of human-centered design. We did do a lot of research with minority communities on the ground, with bankers, with realtors, et cetera. And we started to piece together that picture. But really at the heart of what we uncovered was this idea, and it's with these two circles in the middle, was this idea of what it's called the systems archetype. And these are sort of archetypes of behaviors in certain types of systems. There's this one called a success to the successful archetype. And the classic example of this is, in a company, if there's a boss and has two employees, and there's a task to be done, and the boss says to one of the employees, okay, Sarah, you do this, and Tommy, you're not going to get this opportunity. Well, Sarah does that task, does well at it, and then the next time there's something big and important that comes along, the boss gives it to Sarah, right? It's success to the successful. And as one side of the equation gets stronger, then the other side, has less and less opportunity over time. And this is basically the dynamic that has been happening in the American housing market. Is that early in the 20th century, the American government essentially subsidized Americans becoming homeowners, but excluded minorities from those interventions. And what's happened subsequently is that early home ownership turned into generational wealth, and steadily over time enabled white families to benefit, and Black families and minority families, not just Black families but minority families, to didn't have as much opportunity, and it contributed to the housing gap and the wealth gap. So what we started to do, and this is where things kind of got a little bit interesting, is we said, what we need to do in order to break this archetype, this wheel, is that we need to start to focus on change gears from, part of what happened in 1968 is, when housing discrimination was made illegal, it was just everybody needs to be treated equally. But when this archetype is in place, when you create both sides or treat both sides equally, that gap is just going to grow. So what we are proposing with Freddie is that, sorry about that siren. What we're proposing with Freddie is that they need to take an equity-based approach that targets, wait 1 second.
All right, I think we're just about good.
Okay, that targets specifically, Black Americans and minority communities for interventions. So, I think this is sort of easier said than done because there's a lot of policy, a lot of legal framework that focuses in on, just being able to treat treat everybody equally. But if we really want to solve this problem, then we need to do something differently. We do need to take an equity-based approach. So it's kind of like we want to be able to have our cake and eat it too. So we kind of got to with this, and there's a number of different sort of solutions for solving that problem. But again, kind of going back to blockchain and saying, are there opportunities here for Black Americans to essentially have a identification that they specifically can control, and they can track and see where it's used, so that on one hand, they can identify themselves as a minority, so that they can get some of those benefits of interventions specifically tailored to help those communities get access to home ownership. But then not be exposed to some of the discrimination that comes along with saying, identifying as a minority. So it's a really interesting challenge that we uncovered through the systems work, and then are thinking explicitly around a mechanism to help target those interventions. So really, really fascinating project. This is one of the ones when we got approached by the clients and we won this work. I definitely said this was I said two things. I said, at first, I'm like, this is an incredibly humbling opportunity to be able to work on this. There's been so much incredible scholarship, academic work done on this. There's been incredible activism around this. What are we going to do to help further this cause? And I think part of what we decided was that, we really were going to stand on the shoulders of giants, of all those incredible people that have historically done work in this space, and try to bring together that thinking in a really meaningful way. And that we were going to approach it from that systems view, which is 10,000 foot down, and then from a very human view, from an ethnographic perspective, and try to bring all of that together in a meaningful way. So we recently finished this project. I think also in parallel to it, the Biden administration, who has some oversight of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, has been really pressuring the organizations to move the needle on equity in housing. So we also in parallel completed basically a response to a brief from the Biden administration that's tied with Build Back Better. So some of those funds, and it's close to, I'm trying to remember specifically what it is, between $1 and $2 trillion are going to be focused in areas to do this. And this was the first time I'd ever really been able to work in policy or government. And sort of for one of our tracks of work, it was like the deliverable was like a 50-page, Word document. There wasn't any sort of tangible design, in the classic formal sense. But we were able to kind of work together to think about how to address this, address the gap in sort of a really meaningful way. So very strategic, sort of very sort of logically oriented, but really kind of the work of a lifetime. And something I again will always feel sort of humbled to be able to contribute to. So that's a little bit about me and some of the work I've done personally at Frog. And maybe I'll stop and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, I can just kind of run into some of what I teach at NYU, and sort of I think I've been teaching for the past bunch of years, and just kind of informs my worldview in an interesting way. But I'll stop and see if there's any questions. Cool. We'll just keep rolling then.
Okay.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah, great.
I haven't fully articulated it, so please excuse me. I'm wondering what the reaction. So you're working in design at a very high level, I think, and I've been always curious as to like these corporations like JP Morgan, of the giants of the world, and they're thinking behind like human-centered design, like not like it's easy to assume that they're not designers there, but there probably are designers there who are very familiar with human-centered design. But are you working with them? Are you working with the marketing folks who might not be as familiar? Like how do you have to sell design to these sort of corporations? Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, Ryan, great question, and thanks for jumping in. I mean, this is a good and bad thing, but I think that the business world is much more design literate than it was at the beginning of my career. And even in my time at Frog, I oftentimes felt like we were communicating on like a PhD level to clients that were, in elementary school. And I think that gap has really closed. So I think that many corporations see the value of design and understand and have understand some of the mechanics and language around it. Whether they truly know what it is and how to action it and incorporate it, it's sort of all over the place. But I think the design definitely has a seat at the table. I mean, JP Morgan and Chase is really interesting. Most of the people that we interact with there are on the business side. So they're coming up with an idea or a challenge that they're trying to activate. Interestingly enough, like a lot of them have been in design firms. Like one of my favorite collaborators is a ex-IDEO guy. So it's like, I feel like the thinking has penetrated the thinking and the people have penetrated most big organizations in a big way. Whether they get and appreciate some of the specifics about it and know how to incorporate it is kind of a different thing. But I don't know, it's a very different environment than earlier in my career.
And I have a question about your learning curve, because you shared with us some of your really like all that early stuff from Cranbrook, which is so exciting. It's so full of Cranbrook and Cranbrook energy, right? Yeah. And then we jumped into a lot of the work at Frog. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that learning curve.
Yeah. I'll say I skipped over an intermediate step. I was working for this company. When I got out of Frog, when I was finishing up at Cranbrook, I had this offer to go like work with this like Nike like lab in Japan, which was awesome. And they were like, we want you to come to Japan and like hang out and do this like incredible work. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to like, I don't know. It didn't resonate with me at the time. Just make more beautiful stuff. I was so hungry to like kind of get in the world and kind of get back to that original idea of like, I want to have some kind of impact. I don't know what that means at all, but I want to have some kind of impact that's beyond like making really cool things with really cool people and tapping into that. So like, I really had that bug in my bonnet. And, I ended up working, this is hysterical. You're going to laugh at this, is I ended up working for a digital advertising agency for a couple of years afterwards called Organic. They're one of these OG agencies that, was around since the start of the commercial internet. And
I had a classmate who worked for Organic here locally.
Oh yeah, cool. It was great. Really smart, wonderful, digital advertising people. And on one hand, I was like a creative director for Jeep, so making videos of Jeeps driving over boulders in the high Sierras, was like one day, and then the next day was like kind of being a UX designer on like a big e-commerce site. So it's kind of like the weird combinations of both of those worlds, and it was. I think it was like probably one of the best jobs that you can have in that sort of like marketing, communications, digital ad universe. And I had fun, but I was just like very, very bored. And, when I got recruited to go to Frog, I was like, the things that I'm really interested in is, A, launching things, putting things out in the world, but B, creating utility, having something that, the fruits of my labor be something that's like very, very sort of meaningful and has utility. And I think that's something that's really in the heartbeat of Frog. We don't do campaigns, we don't do things like this. We're creating products and services that hopefully make people's lives better. And I'll talk a little bit about Frog, but Carla, to your point of like the learning curve, I mean, my first year at Frog was like very, very, very hard. It was really steep, trying to wrap my head around very ambiguous challenges from clients, shaping those in a meaningful way, doing great design, doing great research, understanding and creating the strategic context, collaborating really closely with technologists. And, I think a lot of folks that come to Frog struggle that first year. And I think the reason is, I always say that, everywhere else I worked, I worked in very different fields. Like when I was working at an architecture firm doing urban planning for the Big Dig in Boston, like that was easier to figure out than some of the things I was doing at Frog, even though I don't have a background in architecture at all, even though I have no idea what urban planning is. Like I kind of got what was happening. But I think part of the reason why it's so different at Frog is like everywhere else I was like kind of doing similar things again and again and again, right? So it was like going to the gym and working on, just lifting one weight, and then, your arms get ripped. But going to Frog was like, you're learning how to swim. It's a full body workout. You're breathing in the water. You're trying to master your strokes. It's exhausting. You're in a very foreign environment. And, but after a certain period of time of that, you have all of these like horizontal, vertical, tangential skill sets and experience that enable you to like kind of solve a lot of different or contextualize design in your practice in a lot of different ways. And it took a long time. And, I'm still, I think one of the things I'm still thankful for is I'm still having the opportunity to learn and explore and change and grow at Frog. But, again, you're exposed to a lot of different things and given a lot of autonomy and freedom to solve those design challenges in a way that's like sort of meaningful. But the learning curve was very steep indeed, but, also very meaningful. Cool. Any other questions before I keep running? Okay, cool. So a little bit about what I teach at Tandon. So Tandon is NYU's engineering school. So these are technology people, technology managers, a lot of different paths of life. I think a lot of what we get are these product owners or people that want to be product owners going through school. It's a graduate level course, but this is kind of like a little bit of the opener for that I teach. For them. And I think, again, I think it comes back to this idea of like trying to understand the context of the space that you're designing. And like Le Corbusier said this, like if you're going to design a chair, like what's the room the chair's in, what's the house that the room is in, what's the neighborhood, what's the city, and that kind of thinking really can help. So anyway, thinking about this course, I call it design strategy. But I think an underlying idea is like we're living in this time of incredible abundance. Through most of human history, there wasn't a lot of choice. There wasn't a lot of options for anything, for food, for entertainment, for people to hang out with. Now, a lot of that is different. It's not equally experienced by everybody throughout the world, but generally, we're living in a time of incredible abundance. Many of the stats to the world are really positive. Life expectancy is up. Extreme poverty is like way down. This is just monumental changes of things that have existed throughout human history in the last 100 years have changed really meaningfully for the better. There are also a lot of negatives, right? So life is getting less diverse. The climate change is definitely happening. It's not all peaches and cream. There are definitely some trade-offs. A lot of this, I think, is come from like this chaos of, nature and entropy. And this is a favorite example of mine. Even like shipping is like yielded to order. And I don't know if any of you folks are big book readers. I would suggest there's a book called The Box, which if you're interested in sort of big design or infrastructure design, I think is an amazing book. It basically talks about how the global shipping industry started, and it basically changed the world. You want to talk about something that created a lot of utility and change people's lives, that's a really good one. But essentially, it used to be very expensive to get anything anywhere, via ship, and now it's incredibly inexpensive to basically connect the world and to get goods going all over the place. But I think that is an example of design. I mean, design is all around us. The world has been aggressively designed, every aspect of it to be the way that we experience it. And I think that's just sort of accelerating. What that sort of netted out to is like more people, more connections, more possibilities, and like more complexity. And we're at the state where half of the world is connected together through smartphones. And if you start to think about like the craziness of that is, for a huge portion of the world, we can be connected with people, we can understand where they are, how they're feeling, what's going on. It's just absolutely more than anybody could wrap their heads around. So, I think we also are kind of going from this order into this chaos, right? Like phones, the way that we connected with each other. I'll never forget the first time I saw a cell phone in a TV show. It was the X-Files, and it basically changed TV forever. Is when Mulder could pick up his phone and call Sully, and then they were able to converse and converge on whatever, an alien. But it was this device that essentially changed TV together, and we forever. And now we're sort of seeing that to the nth degree. And of course, everybody's favorite example over the last couple of years is what's been happening in investment. With Wall Street bets and GameStop, et cetera, which is something we spend a lot of time and energy on. It's you can never predict these things. They are sort of unprecedented and amazing. So, I think if that's like kind of the backdrop of the context of like how we're trying to, design or make decisions in the world, this is, this sort of design strategy, this course that I teach is basically a big part of my practice personally, but there's always like sort of the human-centered design and the design thinking component. I'm sure people have mixed feelings about design thinking. I do too. But I think, we can basically label that bucket empathy and creativity and whatnot. There's also this analytical thinking, which I think is a traditional deductive reasoning analysis. And then I think there's also the systems thinking component where you're trying to understand the whole. And I think this is really difficult, but this integrating all of these different mindsets together is a way to help to support some thoughtful decision making for the complex world that we live in today. On the creativity side, you have something that's very constructive, right? Very constructivist. The system thinking is very sort of holistic, and the analytical thinking is kind of breaking big problems into small problems. I think any one of these on its own creates a lot of blind spots, but by bringing them together, you can uncover better options and some different decisions that you go forward. And this is really kind of the process that we leverage with Freddie Mac. After working at a career of 20, I don't know, trying to think about what it is, to about 25 years, and kind of going through this whole period of time of all of this work and school and options and experience. It's the Freddie Mac was the first project that I had where we were able to really bring all of this together in a meaningful way, and I think led to some interesting, novel, important approaches to solve a dictionary definition of a wicked problem is racism, essentially. So that's kind of big part of what I teach. I think what I'm talking about here is, legacy strategy is very sort of waterfall. You're basically breaking things down into smaller pieces and then building and launching. can get you great results for many things, but kind of gets you on this sort of defined path. And I think in particular, when you're trying to solve a system-wide challenge, then I think might not lead to the best outcomes. And I think the really interesting thing about technology, and I was kind of referring to this before with you folks and being able to sort of follow along with your lives and your work through Instagram, is like, the technology has like kind of closed the gap between competitors. It's closed the gap between people around the world. So, the complexity and the dynamics that sort of come from that is everywhere. It's not just for racism. It's not just for global banking. It's, someone that has a clothing boutique in downtown Detroit is now competing with Amazon or competing with somebody in Japan. It's that technology has, shrunken the world in such a way that we're exposed to all of these different dynamics that I think using this mode of thinking primarily is always going to be challenging. So I think this idea is that, design strategy is analytical as much as it's creative. I think formerly, we saw a lot with our clients, and Ryan, I think this is sort of the mode of thinking. What I think a lot of clients used to be in is like, what do we need? What could that be? As opposed to the other sort of direction is like, what should be, and then working backwards to what we need. And that combination has been, I think, really helpful and a big part of the way that we work at Frog and a big part of what I teach. And I think the thing that's been most interesting about teaching is there's a couple of things. Like, one is how well-versed and versatile with this sort of integrated mindset a lot of the students are. Very, very advanced and able to pick up things. I think the other thing that's really interesting, in particular over the last couple of years, is we at NYU, it's a big international community. So kind of learning a lot from people all over the globe with a lot of different backgrounds and experience, like their perspectives on this. And, this has happened more than once where, I've had a student in the class and we've been talking about a bunch of this stuff. And in particular, sort of that idea of like, businesses all over the world are competing with people that are thousands of miles away, or small businesses are competing with huge businesses, and how that's all, sort of working. And, in particular, I just remember one of our students was like, my dad owns a light manufacturing company in India. And, I'm in the States studying, but like this summer, I'm going to go back and do X, Y, and Z from this. And now I understand how I can help the family business operate in make better decisions, tap into different markets, be more productive, et cetera. So that I think has been really fulfilling, really interesting. And again, I think all of this comes back to this idea of like trying to understand the underlying context for the things that you're trying to do or the spaces that you're trying to design. And then with a good understanding of that, being able to create interventions that are really effective. So I'll pause and see if there's any questions on that before moving to the next section. Okay, cool. Let's keep going. I'll do this next section like super duper fast. This is kind of like the standard Frog story, but I think it's kind of fun. Carla, when you were at Frog, was Hartmut still around, or was that like just after Hartmut sold?
He sold. He was around at, like the holiday party, and he would walk through the studio sometimes. But
did you cross paths with Luke Williams out in San Francisco? Yeah, Luke. When I joined Luke, who's an amazing industrial designer and now teaches at NYU Business School, amongst other things. But he would say his desk was literally right outside of Hartmut's office. So he would live in fear of like when Hartmut would come by and look over his shoulder and start to mess with things. I don't know.
How funny. That's a beautiful time. I don't know. I think it's wonderful when the founder can be there and you have that connection. But yeah, Luke was also really, the strategy team was really building at Frog in San Francisco, and then I had moved to New York, and Luke was in New York, so that was kind of fun to sort of catch up with him there. I've lost touch with him.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
he's tremendous. But anyway, like, Frog was started by this lunatic, and I don't use that word lightly. I mean, Hartmut was really a iconoclastic lunatic. And he, was this industrial designer. He started the firm in the late 60s. And he, German, and we're all familiar with this idea of form follows function, very German, very proper. And Hartmut like kind of flipped the bird and he says, actually, no, like that's not what design is. That's not how it could work. There's this alternative reality of form should follow emotion. The purpose of design isn't to purely serve functional purposes. It's really to, activate people's emotions. So, that idea of, this is some of the work that he created for Sony with these televisions. And I don't know if anyone remembers TVs from your grandparents, maybe, that were like in wood encased, things that look like Louis XIV furniture. When Hartmut was designing this is what, a record player looked like. This is what a TV looked like. And Hartmut came along and said, no. Like, that's not what these things have to look like. They don't have to look like furniture from the 1800s. They can take on this new modern form for this new modern media that, is reflective of the times that we're living in. And that's going to change people's feelings around when they interact with that content on television. So similar to like what we did with HBO Max, thinking about how that product experience could amplify, exploring the content, Hartmut was doing with sort of physical design. And, Hartmut was, Steve Jobs saw his work and said, you got to move your little studio from the Black Forest of Germany, which is in the middle of nowhere, to the San Francisco Bay Area. And, Frog and Hartmut, this is before my time, obviously, was the kind of exclusive design partner for Apple for about a decade, and did, some legendary industrial design. I think subsequently, the world has been more software oriented and connected, and Frog has, played, sort of gone that route, where, we do a tremendous amount of software, we do a tremendous amount of convergent or embedded work, we do a lot of service design, strategy, of course. And I think the most interesting thing that's happened in Ryan, this kind of comes back to your question again, is over the last 10 years, I think many of our clients have said, we need your help creating a great product and service, but we also need our organization to like look and feel in some ways more like Frog. So can you help us to be more customer centric? Can you help us to build and expand and scale our design capabilities? Because that's really important. So Frog has kind of gotten into this business of organizational design. And I think initially, a lot of us were kind of doing it and faking it, but we've also hired a lot of experts, which is thankful. And I've learned a lot from that. But Carla, back to your question of like the learning curve, for a period of time there, I was doing all this work with clients and getting very frustrated because like we weren't able to like build and get things out to market, or if we did get things to market, they would fall apart after we stepped away. And it just kind of became obvious to a lot of us that our clients needed a different kind of help in kind of going through that transformation and new capability building on their for their organization. So that has become a really important part of what we do. And I think also a lot of Frog alumni have gone out into the world and are now leading design at corporations, sort of big and small, which has helped. But this is a little bit of what we do. I have some other case studies that I can show. But I think back to these ideas of really thinking about design that's breaking through boundaries. It's digital, it's physical. It could be operational. It's like who you're hiring. It doesn't really matter. The context. We're always just trying to think about how to improve people's lives, create utility. Technology is always going to be a really big part of what we do, and then really thinking about strategies. That creative act. We've worked with a lot of like very big folks, so Apple and Sony, Beth Comstock, who's an incredible leader at GE. We also have a ventures practice, which is really interesting, where entrepreneurs come to us and we basically we take reduce fees for equity in the company. So we've been able to help launch a few businesses, a lot of businesses that have performed really well. Alto is one. I can talk a little bit more about that later. I've talked about like sort of this era of the company. So, Hartmutt's work in the 70s and then into Apple, the world getting sort of more digital through the 90s and 2000s, it's convergent, and then kind of thinking beyond design. And then this is kind of like the wheel of all the stuff that we do. I would say at the heart of what we do is like we either help build new businesses, new products, new businesses, or we're like kind of helping to modernize things that are older. So like a modernizing something that's older is like, I work really closely with Dick's Sporting Goods to help them figure out how they can compete effectively against an Amazon or a more specialty, like kind of sports good retailer. And then an example of a new business that we built, I'll walk through one in a minute. But essentially, other things that are important to us is the internal capability building, the idea of circular purpose. So doing a tremendous amount of work right now in circular economy around products. But yeah, I think really the heart of what we try to do is transform human experiences and have these kinds of impacts on the world. Big team, we're a part of I think when I started at Frog, there was probably about 700 people, and then it's kind of like gone up and down. Now we're at about 2,200 frogs around the world, which is pretty amazing. Some other firms have like kind of joined ours, and just incredible talent all over the world. And I think really kind of the amazing thing is, silver lining of the pandemic is, I think, whereas we were always like very like sort of studio based, an emphasis on the studio, now where it's a much more global community and we're working with people all over the world. So as opposed to like you get like the best person for mobility, like in your studio or in your region, you're getting the best person's work and mobility from all over the world, which is pretty fantastic. So I'll jump forward just into some of like Frog's greatest hits. This is one that's relatively recent, and I picked out a few of these because I thought they might be interesting in particular for what my understanding of what the focus for 4D is. There's obviously lots of other ones, but kind of like this blend of design and technology and great experience. But Disney came to us and they said, we've got this like really tactical problem. We want to get people in and out of the park faster. When it's 8 a.m. and people want to get into the park, there's like a line down the parking lot of people waiting. It's a terrible experience. And then when they get in the park, same thing, lines everywhere. What can you do to help us with that? And we came up with this idea for a wearable. It was called the Magic Band, and it had short range and long range RFID in it. And then the short range, you can see this little girl sort of checking in to a ride, would enable you to do that. And then you have this safari guy, I don't know what ride that is, but he's got sort of his tablet there, and he knows who she is and what's going on, and can be sort of like very attentive to that guest's need. But then also the long range RFID is like we could sort of pick up where people were in the park and help to like usher crowd control and get people through. So, Disney basically said, great, we've got this connected technology in the park that is really, really helpful. But what else can we do with it? Well, we're going to enable people to pay for things for this. We're going to enable people to check into their hotel rooms. We're going to enable people to book time with Cinderella to come up to their daughter and say, okay, Lisa, happy birthday. I know I'm your favorite, princess, and everything's great. So it started to, take a lot of the friction out of the park experience and kind of create these new opportunities for the Disney magic to come to the foreground. And I think what was important about this is like the Imagineers, like they were in charge of the parks. Like we weren't like messing with any of the IP of the parks. We were just, helping to facilitate how people interacted with it in a really meaningful way. So, the people were spending more money, they were much more satisfied, more people were able to get into the park, and they weren't necessarily feeling like the park was more crowded. So really big story. This project, it was 5 years. It was like millions and millions of dollars of frog fees. It was about $1 billion worth of investment into the parks to get this to work really well. But I think it's just something that, Frog is pretty proud of, to be able to bring into the world, and a really, really interesting implementation of like wearable technology, service design, and really kind of thinking through that full journey. Like there's a small, snapshot of this in the upper right-hand corner of like, all of the different things, this is a simplified version, but all of like the different moments from like, starting your journey, starting to think about going to Disneyland. And really what that starts actually with is memories of, for most people, it starts with memories of when you were a kid and, gonna go to Disneyland, and then wanting to share that with your family, all the way through, buying your tickets and, doing your travel and doing your hospitality, your lodging, et cetera, to going there and to like reliving those memories and going again. But, we were really able to think through that full journey and think about how the technology could make that better. So really interesting project. The next one was something that we worked on in New York. It's for UN OCHA. So OCHA is the Office for Crisis and Humanitarian Affairs. And basically when there's an earthquake in Nepal, or there is Ebola outbreak somewhere in Africa, OCHA goes in and helps to make sure that NGOs or government, agencies are able to help support what's happening on the ground. And one of the things that they saw was that in a hot spot, and these things, kind of crop up as crises happen, there's a lot of people on the ground, that are highly fragmented, not communicating with each other, in these geographies trying to help. And there isn't any way for researchers or people or government officials back home to really understand in a granular way what's going on, or for people on the ground to know what's happening. So what we did is we came together and we created something called the Humanitarian Data Exchange that basically had the purpose of collecting and normalizing the data that the folks on the ground were compiling, and then sharing that more broadly, and then putting in controls and permissions so that certain aspects of the data could be not shared kind of more broadly or only with specific people. And for instance, if you're in a hot spot where there's violence, you may not want a certain group in the area to know who, what sort of like minority is in a certain area. So there's a lot of really interesting implications and sort of behavioral aspects to this. So like one of the challenges that we had was everybody's collecting unstructured data in different ways. And then we're trying to combine those together. It's like, how do you normalize that? How do you start to create tools to help when some of these NGOs are collecting data, tools and process, when they're collecting that data, to kind of begin to structure it in a certain way? And then how do you make this more valuable? So really fascinating work, and I think another thing we're really proud to be able to contribute to. This is another one that was kind of interesting. Equinox came to us, and like they were really struggling because essentially people just don't want to go to gyms anymore. They prefer to go to SoulCycle. They prefer to go to yoga. They kind of want like the variety of fitness options. So Equinox is basically saying, how can we personalize our experiences for all of our gym members in a way so that we can give them that variety and expose them to that variety that they are kind of going elsewhere for, but like within our four walls. So we created this program called TRX and really essentially helped them to create an algorithm that's kind of like a Myers-Briggs personality quiz that enabled people to input their preferences, and then we would sort of help cater fitness experiences and options for them, and was something that we built and rolled out. But again, sort of like, how can we drive some behavior change using digital and data in a new way? This one is so fascinating. I didn't work on this, and I hear it was very painful, but really, really cool. Basically, Deutsche Telekom came to us and said, 5G is coming. Nobody understands what it is. We don't understand what it is. And, we have a hard time explaining it and demonstrating the value of it to people. So Frog, can you help us to identify a number of viable use cases for 5G, and then actually use the technology, edge technology, edge services, to create demonstrations of what that could look like. So there was like a technology strategy piece, and then there was a technology building thing. And some of what you're kind of seeing here are demonstrations of could you use edge technology to remotely operate autonomous vehicles as like a fallback if something happens? Or can you operate underwater welding, remotely from anywhere in the world, on an oil rig to reduce costs and things there. So the team, essentially built demos, really functioning demos that worked with zero latency for all of these potential use cases. And there was a team in Germany, and there was a team in SF, and they were building things and running demos, kind of across the globe, but back and forth. So really fascinating, I think really challenging on a lot of levels, but really cool work. We did this work for SF MoMA, or with SF MoMA. They had a Magritte exhibit, and Frog went in and built a complementary AR immersive experience. So really playing with these ideas of surrealism and how to kind of play with people and enable them to experience some of the concepts of Magritte's work in a really tangible way. So we built all of these kind of window panes that were in a sort of complementary section of the exhibit, and was super duper successful. We also built into this some interesting sort of tracking for anonymous tracking for individuals going through as a way to experience this. So look at the analytics of that and sharing those with the museum subsequently. IKEA, we helped them build their AR furniture app, which was shown in, it was an Apple demo. So really kind of cool program there. This one is super duper mind blowing. So we work with DARPA on this thing called Plan X, and Plan X is basically their cybersecurity defense mechanism. So it's basically a military operation that is designed to help protect the United States from cyber warfare. So this was a multi-year project, but really just trying to go into the organization, understand what they were trying to do, build sets of different tools to help them, collaborate more effectively around threats. So we were building product, we were kind of building capabilities in the organization. We were doing some organizational design to help facilitate new ways of working. And then some of this gaming type stuff, we helped to build a VR sort of very gamey interface to explore some of these things. That wasn't necessarily the final direction, but it was something that the clients were able to bring onto 60 Minutes and demonstrate there as part of the work. But really, really, we can talk about it now because it's on 60 Minutes, but super top secret, kind of amazing work. Very obviously technology focused. And then the last one that I'll share is this company called Alto, which is a rideshare company, kind of like a competitor to Uber and Lyft. They're operating in Texas and actually doing pretty well. It's kind of based on this insight that a lot of women in particular don't like taking Ubers and Lyfts because of fear of security. So it's how do you create an ultra comfortable, ultra secure, ultra kind of transparent ride sharing service that's sort of tailored to, kids, women, anybody that's concerned about these things. That was the idea. The entrepreneur came to us. This is a Frog Ventures project, so we took equity stake in the company, but we basically designed and built, this experience from the ground up using cloud infrastructure. And, essentially a team at Frog kind of recreated a lot of the ride sharing infrastructure and experience in this sort of like more targeted way from the ground up. So you start to see some of the conceptual architecture on the right side. There was the cloud-based architecture that was connecting to the apps. There was all of these things that were happening inside of the vehicle, which were really interesting. This wasn't a project that I was personally involved in, but I think it's just another kind of example. And this is kind of going to be I think a recurring theme. It's just so easy and cheap, relatively speaking, to build things these days through software and capabilities that are available. This wouldn't have been possible a generation ago to build it this cheaply, this quickly, with this small of a team, and it really just is now. So I think this was like a couple years to get this, like from an idea to up and running, maybe 18 months to getting the first cars out on the road. And yeah, I think they're doing reasonably well. So those are, I think, just another kind of like bunch of Frog case studies, and ones that I thought would be sort of meaningful to share with you folks, because I think they really do kind of highlight how some of like the Frog design and technology and strategy pieces come together in meaningful ways. So I'll pause again and see if there are any kind of questions. Cool. So the last section, I kind of wanted to, like, when Carla and I were originally talking, I think one of the things that you shared, Carla, you're like, it would just be sort of interesting, maybe for the students to get an idea of like what's going on out in the world, and like what are the opportunities for design that's happening out there. And I kind of give that a little bit of thought. And I think like just wanted to talk about these like kind of two paths. They're not exclusive paths. They're just like kind of two things that I see happening right now. And like, I think, really, like, it's a great time to be a designer. And it's a really great time to be a designer that understands and can work in technology. I think one of the things that we're seeing, this Nick Fink is, one of these design Twitter people, and who is pretty funny, but like, he's like, had this tweet. It's like, so let me get this straight. Microsoft is paying some of its software development engineers a salary of $500,000 a year. And he's saying designers ask for more. And like, this is something like that I've sort of seen throughout my career, is like, before the internet, like I think a lot of designers, industrial designers or graphic designers or whoever, like they're designing campaigns or brochures or record jackets. And I start my career, and because of the internet, like I have access and foray to like a whole different conversation. And I think I've really appreciated the opportunities that it's opened up for me, and like that's just continued, especially right now. I think there's incredible opportunities to make a ton of money, find the things that you really want to find, work with really interesting people on really interesting projects, do your own thing. It's just an amazing time. But I think like one of the things, if you were going to kind of go down this route of, I think some of the big companies like, Google, Apple, Amazon, et cetera, and like all of those people would love to hire you. They'd love to pay you absolutely oodles of money. There's like, I think some trade-offs, right? And I think part of that is like this idea of the studio. And like, this is like a little bit in flux, and the traditions of that are like Bauhaus, Cranbrook. Frog is definitely a big part of this. It's kind of this melting pot where all of these people come together and ideas are shared. And, there's this kind of magic, right? That's incredibly unique. It's very different than like kind of a corporate environment where you are like making things and shipping things. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of things that are good with that, but I think the creative culture, there's tension there with the creative culture. And I think one of the things that I think we've been fortunate with the Frog was to be able to like effectively kind of combine those. But I think it's pretty unique. I think that's one of the things that makes Frog really cool. But like what's happening, right? Because why is this happening? And I think this idea of hopefully everybody's sort of familiar with this idea of software eating the world. And if you're not, read this Mark Andreessen thing, The Journal from 2011. And he's basically saying, software is the way value is predominantly going to be created. It's going to affect absolutely every industry, and it's going to change the world. And, I think that has been playing itself out. One of the things you see here is, a lot of this change in sort of the market capitalization, from 2001 to 2016. It's just sort of continued, but like you have this mix of industrial and petrochemical and retail companies. And then it's basically, FANG essentially. And I think what's happening is that software is enabling a lot of this value to be consolidated and concentrated in technology companies, not just these companies. There's lots of technology companies out there, but really that starts to happen. I think the cool thing is the software and design kind of go hand in hand. Making great software and design go hand in hand. And like we've sort of seen that change over time. This is like just Google Trends from 2004 to I think 2018 and change, like that the search term UX designer is absolutely exploded. It's actually exploded more than I think some of these other search terms I was looking at versus like industrial designer, service designer, design researcher. There's a lot of different reasons for this. This isn't scientific, but just trying to demonstrate like when it comes to design and software, they kind of go hand in hand, and there's just a lot of opportunity from that. This is again another like sort of scientific, unscientific thing, but like in industry, there's this idea that there should be a ratio between designers and developers, like a 1-to-8 ratio. Most companies don't have that, but like I just did some like back of the napkin sketching, and if there's 36 million GitHub users, which is a proxy for engineers, and if we're trying to hit this 1-to-8 ratio, there would need to be 4.5 million designers for that. At the time I did this, there was like 220,000 UX designers on LinkedIn. So there's like this huge gap, right, between the technology needs, and there's not enough engineers in the world too, but like even if we're trying to keep that ratio, it basically points to there's like a real supply challenge for great designers out in the world. And that leads to a lot of opportunity. And for folks like you that are brilliant, going to an amazing school, get to hang out with Carla all the time, are super creative, but also technology savvy, it yields a lot of opportunity out there. The other thing that's kind of happening is like, okay, the world has been sort of remote. So, we used to have these like sort of split teams that are collaborating all over the place, and then hybrid teams. And now we're like in these remote teams, and then like everybody's remote. So what that's sort of enabled is like, you're now not like, if you live in New York City or you live in Mexico, you can work with anyone, similar to what I was saying with Frog before, like you can find the great projects, you can find the great teams, you can work with anyone, typically sort of all over the world. It's really an amazing time to be a designer. It's an amazing time to be a really talented designer that knows technology, because you can just uncover great opportunities. So there is a little bit of a problem, right? Like there's this talent pipeline problem. There's like not enough good designers in the world. That's why it's amazing that there's a 4D program at Cranbrook. I didn't say this earlier. I'm super jealous of all you people. If, I wish there had been 4D around when I was coming up, I probably would have done that instead. But yeah, there's not enough designers in the world, and that's why I'm passionate about teaching. I'm sure, Carla, that's a part of the reason why you're passionate about teaching, is that design is this incredible potential for us individually, but then I think sort of more broadly collectively, and we just got to get more great designers. I think also this idea of like design sort of moving from a cottage industry into something that's like a little bit more scaled and industrial, and hopefully not losing our soul in the process. But I think, again, technology has enabled us to work with people all over the world. It's enabled us to do that really cheaply, but just kind of learning how to operate at scale. And then I think like this question around the studio, sort of like what has traditionally been this like core of where design happens, whether that's a bigger studio with multiple people or an individual studio, like, can design, and design can be construed in a lot of different ways, but can it achieve sort of its maximum impact or a potential impact within the context of the studio? Like there's definitely some tension there. And I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but there's some tension there. But like, this is what the new landscape looks like, is like designers, and there's a designers, and we see this all the time, at Frog or with our clients or friends that are working there. They just want to work on great projects, right? Primarily, they want to work, they want to grow, they want to evolve, and they want the opportunities to be able to do that. And I think some of that flexibility and being remote, like that'll become the new norm, and people will be able to kind of do that more fluidly. I think the organizations, and this is Frog, this is any of the big tech companies or any of the small tech companies, like they're going to struggle to hire designers in this landscape. So like the people that really get it, they're going to figure out new ways to embrace designers, like new ways of working, and it's going to help them win the war for talent. That's, I think, the new landscape. It's definitely a designer, it's like a buyer's market or seller's market. It's a seller's market. Designers have got a lot of power and option right now. And like, these are, I think, some of the reasons why. But like, back to this idea of like disruptors, I mean, I'm sure you folks are talking a lot about the metaverse and thinking about the metaverse. I think that we could talk about it for days, but I think the most interesting kind of idea around the metaverse is like less in the media and gaming space, although that stuff is super interesting. I think it's like how the metaverse is going to help us to work a little bit differently, how we're going to have a presence. Like, when we're talking like this over Zoom, it's fine. It's a little bit tiring. I know Carla was describing to me how you folks were working over the last couple of years, and it sounds really tough. But better than nothing. But I think this idea of the metaverse being a place where we kind of begin to work differently or support different ways of working is really fascinating. And I'm fond of the Mark Twain saying, like, the history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. It's like, if we look at PCs, like PCs were around a fair amount, but they didn't kind of take off until they started to be used at work. And then, they sort of were everywhere. And then consumers were like, okay, great, I'm using this at work. I see how I can have utility with it at home. And that kind of like brought on the PC era. I'm kind of curious whether like the metaverse will be the same thing. It will be like kind of like small pockets, but then sort of find its like full fruition as like sort of these global workforces start to come together through AR, VR, MR in different meaningful ways. And again, like, that's why, I look at Facebook talking about the metaverse, and I'm like, whatever. But then I like look at Microsoft talking about the metaverse, and Microsoft has always been sort of thinking about the professional and how to, sort of roll software out through their channel, which they do really effectively. And that's why Teams is winning and Slack isn't winning. It starts to become a little bit interesting. But like, when it comes to like the way we're going to start to work together globally in a scaled way, I'm kind of curious about the metaverse for ways of working. And then lastly, like, this isn't going to be easy, but like this, I think, is kind of like the next big thing. Is like, from 2006 to 11, it was all about platforms, right? Apple or AWS. In 2012 to 19, we're getting all this stuff that's getting built on top of platforms, social, gig, marketplaces. I think a big thing kind of going forward is going to be like org, team, and talent. And then in particular, the next section that I'll talk about is like kind of like the creator, which I think is fascinating, but it's going to be much more personal. There's going to be much more equity. It's, where I think like technology was like kind of in some ways like dehumanizing, it's going to emphasize and focus on the individual a little bit more and enable some great things. So I'll stop and see if there's any questions before keep on going.
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So you were talking about how like the bridging of design and code and people that are engineers, how that works. I was just really curious, and I think this is a personal question, but do you code? How did you learn? You came from Cranbrook. Not a lot of people code here. So that's the first question.
Yeah, I don't code anymore. I mean, the whole start of my career, I was writing code. I was building. So this is something I skipped over. Is I left RISD. I was studying illustration and graphic design, and I started a small consulting company with a couple of people. One of them was an engineer. One of them was a business person. And we started to build like basically database-backed websites for big corporations. in a time that just wasn't happening. And, some of the first work I was doing was taking like these deal pipelines that were in mainframe, like black screen, green text, and bringing them into a web environment for the first time. So writing a lot of HTML, not any of the heavy stuff, but writing code. And I haven't really subsequently I haven't been writing code, since the early 2000s subsequently. But technology has always been a big part of what I've done.
Did you learn on the job in that situation, or did you?
Yeah, so I learned a lot on the job, and it was really important to me to like finish my college degree. So there's in the state of New York, it's the state system is called SUNY, and I went to school. I finished up my degree the last couple of years at a SUNY school, and they had actually a pretty decent design school, but they also I was also studying political science and computer science at the same time. So I was taking like classic, C++ classes, and was a very bad at code, but I think made me knowledgeable, appreciative, and dangerous enough to kind of understand the space and work with better, smarter, more talented technologists.
Awesome. So that's great. Thank you. And I have the same question about hardware. Do you work with hardware? Have you done that?
Yeah, so again, really fortunately at Frog to work with super talented and smart folks that are experts in the space. And in particular, I think with like the jukebox is like a great example, is working with some incredible mechanical and electrical engineers to build things and make them into fruition. I think Disney is also another interesting one. Is Frog essentially created all of like the web and mobile based technology, but then partnered with a sister organization called Synapse that did all of the RFID pickups in the wearable, but then all the RFID antennas and network throughout the park. And I don't know, what's really fascinating to me is the more I do this work, the more and this is something that I think is very unique about Frog, is having the opportunity to work alongside of people that have deep expertise in these things, so that in a very mixed discipline way. So like you're sort of specialized, but you are so close to other people that are also specialized that you get this bleed over. And there's more that I know about like some of the inner workings of some of like the deep technology questions and processes than I think if I was working somewhere else where like that would be happening over there. And I think that's part of some of the magic of Frog.
Thank you.
Hi, Sean. I have a question about, well, a lot of the things that you're presenting to us are digital products and services, but some of them cross over into like a hybrid approach. I think many of us here are sort of rooting our practice in physicality and tangibility, right? And I'm wondering like what you think about. So I'm thinking, in the world is moving in this digital space. Am I stubborn in wanting to stay rooted in physicality, at least as a student, or is it like a more dynamic approach that makes me more valuable in a digital world? So I'm wondering what you sort of think about that concept.
Yeah, great question, Ryan. And I would strongly encourage everybody to be like versatile across both. I had a great opportunity to work on this interesting and frustrating project for Warner Brothers on the Harry Potter franchise. This is like super top secret. So, well, actually I can't say it because we're recording, but I'll tell you guys later in the Q&A. Don't worry about it. But I will say that I think pure digital software, it's bits to bits. It's easy, software to hardware or real world stuff is bits to atoms. It's harder, but those are going to be the whole next set of challenges for design and technology, is how can we extract, or how can we leverage a lot of the value that digital can bring in a physical world. So I just think that it's the reason why the digital stuff is happening in big first is because it's easier, not because the other stuff isn't important or valuable. It's just not as easy. Cool.
Yeah, we're seeing, you know, I remember in my industrial design program, everyone wanted, well, there became problems and an app is the solution to it. And then now I'm seeing, you know, like the Disney project you're working on, where it's this hybrid approach, and it's like, no, it's the physicality is coming back into the picture, sort of.
Yeah, it's super funny, Ryan, because very recently in the last year, Disney basically it has an app that does a lot of the things that the Magic Band does. They're still supporting both, but I think they're moving towards that app as a way to support those experiences. I think the fascinating thing though is like real Disney heads are like freaking out about it. They're so bummed about it. There is that like attachment to the physical device, and I think there's also kind of this question, right, is like, I think all of design is behavior change, right? Like we're not designing apps, we're not designing hardware. Like really, if we're going to be successful, we're designing behaviors that, you know, all of the hardware and software, those are interventions to change those behaviors. And I think one of the questions around the Magic Band is like, if it had just been a purely digital intervention and not a physical one, would we have like been successful? Would we have driven the behavior change? And that was like a big question that we had throughout the project. And obviously, you know, we made the decision, or Frog and the clients made the decision to kind of move forward with, you know, a hybrid.
Yeah, and I would just want to interject with this particular point of view. I would argue that even if it's not a band, it's still the physicality, thinking about this as a holistic. And I think everything that you've shown us is about, you've shown us a lot of diagrams looking at systems and societies. And, you know, even you could argue that the car sharing service is an app, but 100%. It's not, right? Like there's all like what happens at the car is different than what happens at your home, is different than what happens when you're in the street. And thinking about the physical body and the state of mind. And I think that that's, you know, even if it's not an app, right? Like
100%. 100%, Carla. And yeah, I think again, it always comes back to, and I love this metaphor, the Le Corbusier chair, right? It's like, if you're going to design a chair, where's the room? What's the house? What's the neighborhood? Where's the city? It's understanding that, you know, the abstract context, but also the literal physical context of where someone is and what they're doing. One of the other favorite Frog stories, and this kind of gets back into the ethnographic research piece, is, you know, doing research, you know, over the last couple of years, a lot of our research has been done remotely. So it's been interview style. And I think all of us are sort of bemoaning that physical context of where and how somebody works. So like classic story is, I was doing a project, an industrial technology project, and, you know, we sort of went in and we had an interview with one of these engineers that, you know, basically ran this like huge industrial turbine. And we kind of had this whole conversation around his workflow, et cetera. And then, you know, we were talking to him at his workstation, and he like, you know, had all of these Post-its all the way around his monitor. And, you know, we got through towards the end of the interview, and then we're like, well, tell us a little bit about your workspace. And he starts to talk about all these things. We're like, well, tell us about these Post-its. And he goes, oh, this is basically how I get my job done, right? Is by looking at all these Post-its and following the sequence and knowing all these codes. And the fascinating thing, you know, Carla, this is back to your point, it's like people are working in a physical world, in a physical context. And if like we weren't there to see that and appreciate that, you know, we wouldn't have understood, you know, the mental model of how this person was working, or the affordances in the physical world that he had created to be able to do that. So again, it's never losing sight of sort of where people are, you know, what is the physical world that they're in, that we're trying to help them navigate or do something new in is incredibly important. Cool. We'll keep cruising. So last section, and I'll go through this pretty quick, is just this idea of like pay attention to what you pay attention to. This is, I think, one of my big lessons from Cranbrook that I have sort of taken with me. But you know, I think in particular, you know, I don't know if you folks are talking about the attention economy at all. It's something I spend a lot of time and energy thinking about and talking about with our clients. And this is something, whether you're a big bank or you're a car company or you're a pharma company, I think, the increasingly what organizations are competing for is just time with people. And again, this comes back to, there are so many options. Everybody's walking around with a connected supercomputer in their pocket that they can get connected to anything at any moment. So the things you're going to spend your time with are going to kind of shape you. So this, I think in particular, is something that I've started to talk about with like a lot of content or a lot of clients, is this idea of the passion economy, and in the context of the attention economy. So the thesis kind of breaks down like this: is like, if competition is shifting, not like I'm trying to get somebody to come to my bank, or I'm trying to get somebody to buy this car, or I'm trying to get somebody to watch this show versus that show. If it's less about that, it's more about competition shifting to like who can spend the most time with people, then, we get into this idea of the passion economy, where like the creator, right, it becomes a career, and that career is really good at capturing attention. And then, in that space where we're in the attention economy, the passion economy is really important, and that individual is really important. It's like collaboration, between people, between big brands and individuals, between groups of people. Like that collaboration becomes the currency for the passion economy. And then like some of these provocations of like what that might look like. So just run through this like pretty quickly. What we mean by attention economy. Love this quote of, tell me what you pay attention to, and I will tell you who you are. Internet, massive abundance, scarcity. We've been talking about this as kind of like in many ways going away. The challenge is like humans aren't wired for incredible abundance, like our minds. This is like a cognitive bias thing where they're like, we put on blinders and we get focused on things. And it's just the way we've evolved. It's enabled us to be very successful from an evolutionary standpoint, but it's also a challenge today. And, back to this idea of, because there's so much, human attention is like the limiting factor for like what everybody's competing for. And Reed Hastings, CEO of Netflix, like sort of famously said, we compete and lose to Fortnite more than HBO, which was, kind of mind blowing at the time. But I think is this idea of, all of these different businesses aren't necessarily competing with their direct competitors. They're competing for that like broader attention. So kind of shifting gears into the passion economy, like content is king, but distribution is the emperor, was this idea that was sort of big in traditional media. And, back to this idea of Google and Facebook, like what's made them successful is this: they've aggregated all of that abundance into something that's usable. Google has aggregated and made the vastness of the internet accessible. Facebook has aggregated and made the social graph and the interest graph like accessible in ways that it wasn't before. If anybody remembers, like America Online or Yahoo, it was like basically a card catalog of what the internet was. Like obviously not going to work, but Google and Facebook have done that, and because of that, they've basically monetized our attention effectively. But then we sort of start to see the shift, right? Is there's the stage one was like the birth of those media platforms. And then we start to see like influencers like kind of getting bigger and starting to have more formal relationships, and like they're bigger things. And then like we're kind of moving into this stage of creator is a career. And this is like, anybody can sort of begin to have a career online. And what's kind of cool about this is like when you compare the passion economy with the gig economy, is the gig economy was like, you can work anywhere and anytime that you want, but you have to be dehumanized and, sort of drive this car in this particular way, or pick out these groceries and deliver them in this certain way, or, sign up to be a task rabbit and you can only do one of these like sort of 4 very prescribed things. And that is the way that, the platform will sort of unlock value for you and value for us. The passion economy is a little bit different. Like it just values individuality and creativity. It's, it comes back to pay attention to what you pay attention to. And then lastly, or this idea is like, we're in the passion economy, and like something that I find is like a very interesting indicative thing is like, most kids would prefer to be a YouTube star over an astronaut. So on the left, we've got Mae Jemison, who's one of my daughter's heroes, first Black woman astronaut. And on the right, there's Liza Koshy, who I also love very much, but is like sort of this YouTube star. It's just like kind of an interesting comparison. So, essentially like what's happening now is like a lot of the tech platforms are, doing what they can to secure the content creators that like who are basically they're like labor forces. And the reason why is these content creators, these creators are so good and so adept at like sort of capturing that attention. I think what's different than before is that, that these tech companies are thinking about not just how do we be successful, but then how do we help creators be successful? And like, there's some lessons, right? Like Vine was, I don't know if any of you used Vine, but Vine, basically was beloved by creators and fans, but didn't really enable fans to monetize anyway. So they got shut down. Whereas Spotify essentially just recently outpaced Apple in terms of podcasts, which is kind of amazing because Apple has got this incredible moat. But one of the reasons why they've done it is they've said, okay, we're going to be successful in podcasting if we make the creators successful. So that kind of gets us into this idea of co-creation. So this idea of the passion economy is a secular wave. It's going to crash over every industry. Legacy media had like these two big influencers, Martha and Oprah, who I love both of them, but the passion economy, it's going to give us thousands or tens of thousands, right, of those billion-dollar brands. And, I think what we're seeing is like kind of in the past, like with U2, like, it's like that process and like it was tightly controlled, but, kind of going forward, we're going to see more things like Olivia Rodrigo that it's less controlled. Like she basically is successful because she put these building blocks of her music onto Twitter and Instagram, and people combined them and matched them up, and they swelled and they took on a life of their own. It was less controlled, but there was sort of that co-creation, that collaboration. So in the passion economy, right, like that collaboration is currency. Madonna, kind of going back to the music metaphor, very controlled, but this coordination around the building blocks, the Lego blocks to generate more activity, which generates more attention, which generates more opportunity, is important. So some provocations, right? I think we're moving from this time where value is exchanged, like I buy a pair of jeans, I wear those jeans, they wear out, they fall apart, to value co-creation, where it's like I buy a pair of jeans, I wear those jeans, I tweet about those jeans, I at Gap, like more energy is sort of built around those things. It's taking on sort of a life and a value creation of its own. And this kind of follows this rise of the service economy, kind of more in a macro sense, where agriculture and industry is like been going down or steady, where services are kind of going up. This is like more of the dominant mode in a macro sense of how value is being created. So these are ideas, bad ideas, but like things to be thinking about. And in particular, I think for you folks, where on one hand, you could go work for Frog, Google, Apple, somebody big in this kind of bigger context of design and technology, or you could have your own studio, be doing your own thing, going down that road, and like you will likely be rewarded there's the opportunity to be rewarded for you following your passions, your interests, and then building, your small but global marketplace for the things that you're doing that you're really good at. And the great thing about the internet is all geographic boundaries have been removed. So for really smart, talented people that want to go deep on something that's really interesting to them, there's the opportunity for them to find a market, to find a place to create their practice, and then have people compensate them for that in a meaningful way using these platforms. So examples, right? Subscription-only content, personalized messages, Substack, OnlyFans, Cameo. I don't know if you folks are following Trevor McVedries, who's amazing, and I would suggest that you do if you're not, but invented Little Michaela. And I get interested about like creators, one of the things that they're limited by is like they're creating the content, they're the face of it. But if you have virtual influencers like little Michaela, and in particular, if you have automation and intelligence behind that, the creators start to take on this different potential scale. This guy, Mr. Beast, who I love and hate, he's kind of like one of these like YouTube stars that, like pioneered the stunt video, but he also did something really crazy a couple years ago. He like created a pop-up burger chain using ghost restaurants and DoorDash. And he basically jumped in IRL in like a very lightweight and sort of meaningful way. So, I think Ryan, kind of coming back to some of the things that you're saying is like, it's easy, quote unquote. There's sets of opportunities and challenges for Mr. Beast to become a YouTube star and stand out there. But then also the bar for him taking those experiences and that fan base physical are like lower than ever. And then you can go do that, have fun, make money, hang out with people in kind of like new and amazing ways. Another thing I really like, and I talked about this with the leadership of the Gap, is there's this business Depop. They've just been bought by Etsy for $1 billion and change. But essentially, they mashed together Instagram and eBay like clothing. And they're able to set up these stores and sort of curate them. And some of them are making like hundreds of thousands of dollars selling vintage clothes, like that are sort of very, them. It's their creative vision. And what I was talking about with the Gap is like you have all these associates in your stores. Like, what if you were able to support them in a way where they could do something similar, and then the Gap and the associates are like kind of co-creating that value together. They love that idea. They thought that was interesting. Another weird thing is that people are making equity investments in creators. Again, like this idea that some of these creators are going to be billion-dollar brands. Like if you could buy a piece of the Oprah brand in the early 80s, that would be pretty interesting. So again, as smart, talented creators, there might be opportunities for people to buy an equity investment in what you're doing because it's so good at capturing attention or playing a role in the media technology design interesting landscape. And lastly, like this other one is really interesting is, the Gucci created this thing called Gucci Garden in Roblox. And, I listened to an interview with the people that built this and like, I don't know, they built it over a couple weeks and they created all these digital goods that were in there. And they sold like $4 million worth of these virtual goods in I think like 2 or 3 weeks. So, there are virtual economies that are happening. They're also that already exist. They're scaling. They're going to become more democratized. And yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of us that are living, working, building, doing a lot of things in our lives in virtual spaces that has a lot of opportunity. So with that, I know we're almost out of time. But I'll stop for a second and see if there's any questions.
I have a question.